go ahead and get started here. We'll do a real quick recap of the Reconstruction Amendments. So if we zoom in here, you'll see that the Reconstruction Amendments themselves are Amendments 13, 14, and 15. They were ratified at the conclusion of the American Civil War and sought to address racial inequality during the Reconstruction era of the United States. Keeping in mind, all of these amendments were not passed at the same time. Number 13 being the first, 14 next, 15 the last, obviously. So, 13th Amendment here, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, what does that mean? Well, it basically means slavery is illegal. You cannot have slaves except as a punishment for crime. Now, prior to the passing of the 13th Amendment, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862, which did nothing. But it was a great speech, beautiful speech, and it really created the sense of urgency to pass and ratify the 13th Amendment among Congress. When the 13th Amendment was first put through Congress, it hit the Senate floor first, and it passed pretty easily with a majority of Republicans being in the Senate, keeping in mind that today's Republicans would be yesterday's Democrats and vice versa. But when the bill, the proposed amendment, reached the House of Representatives, however, it met pretty stiff resistance and was killed due to not having enough support in the House of Representatives. However, a little over a year later, after the re-election of Abraham Lincoln himself and an increase in Republican House members, the 13th Amendment passed the House and was officially adopted into the Constitution on December the 6th, 1865. And we talked about this Supreme Court case here, but we'll navigate really briefly to it. And if we take a look, we'll zoom out just a little bit here. But this is Bailey versus Alabama. And essentially what happened here is Alonzo Bailey, an African-American from Alabama, who agreed to work for the Riverside Company for a set amount of time, I believe it was a year, being paid $12 a month. And he was given a $15 advance, a bonus, if you will. A little over a month into his contract, which it is a year, I see that there now, into his year-long contract, he decided he didn't want to work there anymore, and he left. And basically, the company tried to sue Mr. Bailey to come back and work for free and to refund the $15 that he was initially given. Basically, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you cannot force an individual to work for free. That is slavery. So this was the first example of the newly crowned 13th Amendment being used in Supreme Court law. All right. So good stuff here so far. But we forgot to do one important thing with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. We forgot to grant former slaves full citizenship, which is the purpose of the 14th Amendment. Now, I know this is a nice long piece, and remember, you do not need to write these amendments down. You can find them anywhere on the internet, copy and paste them. Do not need to copy and down this big, long sentence that's up here at the top of the page. But what it says here is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All right. So now that all of you have no idea what this means, let me explain it. So basically what this means is that if you're born in the United States, you have an American parent, or you pass a citizenship test, if you do any one of those three things, you are automatically a citizen of the United States. And this includes all former enslaved persons. All of those people now have to follow the laws. So it was ratified in 1868, just a little under 3 years after the 13th Amendment. And it was essentially created to ensure equal citizenship among former enslaved persons so that they had the right to sue another individual or citizen in the court of law and have all the protections that are guaranteed to them in the United States Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. Of course, equal citizenship was not achieved due to this amendment, and there was quite a few instances of racial tension and laws, including the Jim Crow laws and poll taxes, which we're going to get to in just a minute, which were a fee you had to pay to vote. So a key portion of this amendment includes the prevention of deprivation of life, liberty, or property. And this has been interpreted very, very broadly. And the reason I say broadly is because the Supreme Court has basically said deprivation of life, liberty, or property means people pretty much get to do whatever they want as long as it's not illegal and it doesn't violate your way of living and the way you live your life. So the 14th Amendment was actually utilized in the Supreme Court case in 2015 that made same-sex marriage a protected right under the United States Constitution, including in all the states where it previously had been illegal. So again, same-sex marriage, totally legal. It is a constitutional right, according to the 14th Amendment, as of the 2015 Supreme Court ruling. Now, this protection has been the basis for many Supreme Court rulings, this prevention of deprivation of life, liberty, and property. The first of which is Brown versus Board of Education. And to give you a little bit of a backstory, in 1896, there was a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And in Plessy versus Ferguson, it basically allowed public schools and all state-sponsored schools to segregate, meaning they would have a school for Caucasian citizens and they would have a school for African American citizens. And as long as those facilities were of equal caliber, meaning they taught the same, students had access to the same resources, then segregation was totally 100% legal in 1896. However, the case we came to talk about, Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education essentially reversed Plessy versus Ferguson in 1954. It said that state-sponsored schools cannot be segregated, and that the schools that had been segregated were in fact not separate but equal. They were very unequal, particularly when it came to minority schools or predominantly African-American schools that had to deal with poorly constructed buildings or old buildings, textbooks that were decades out of date if they received textbooks, not having adequate amounts of funding to pay teachers who were also normally minorities or African-Americans. So in 1954, it was brought before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled unanimously 9-0. Very rare in the history of the Supreme Court that they go 9-0, that they were not separate but equal, and demanded immediately that the United States desegregate their schools. It took quite a long time to finally desegregate those schools, but eventually it did happen, and we did desegregate all of the schools in the United States. Now, the second case here is Roe v. Wade. Now we're changing gears a little bit. We're moving away from education and we're moving into more personal rights. Roe v. Wade was a landmark case in 1973. The court ruled 7-2 in this case. But essentially what this means is that under the Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment, women have the right to have an abortion. And that right cannot be taken from them. Now, of course, as we all know, that does not stop each individual state from setting certain regulations and certain laws regarding abortion, when you can get one and when it's legal to get one, when it is illegal to get an abortion. However, in Roe v. Wade, getting an abortion is a protected right under the 14th Amendment, and it is the woman's decision, and it says woman's decision in the law. So men out there, you don't have a choice, but of course, it is the woman's body. Now, Roe v. Wade has been pretty controversial from this point forward, and there are a lot of groups out there that argue that a fetus is a life, and some groups that argue that it's not. And the opinion on this truly doesn't matter, whether you believe it is a fetus or not. Basically, what it comes down to is that the United States Supreme Court has ruled that it is a constitutional law, and if you don't agree with it personally, then that's okay. But it is a constitutionally protected right. All right, so the 14th Amendment, again, like I said, has been interpreted pretty broadly, and it's covered things such as same-sex marriage, education, and women's body rights and abortion. So the 14th Amendment is very, very broad and has always been interpreted as such. The last amendment we're going to talk about today is Amendment 15. And this amendment's pretty short and sweet and to the point, but it basically says the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So while this is pretty easy to figure out, I'm going to go ahead and spell it out for you. This means that every male person can vote in the United States, or at least idealistically, in a perfect world. That's what this means, but that's not actually what happened. But I want to draw your attention to that last sentence there. It says, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It does not say gender. So women still not getting the right to vote here. Of course, we all know that with the passing of the 19th Amendment, but women are still being left behind here. So people of color and former enslaved persons are now getting the right to vote as long as they are men, as long as they are males. But this didn't exactly do the trick, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about in just a second. This amendment was ratified in 1870, so just about almost 2 years after the 14th Amendment, and it was created to ensure the right to vote to former enslaved male persons. And basically, the thought process behind that is not illogical. It is these people are now citizens of the United States. They should have the right to elect people who are leading them. They should have the right to choose who the individuals that are going to make decisions on their behalf and draft them into war potentially. They wanted to be able to decide who those persons were. So very easy. However, many states found ways around allowing former slaves to vote, such as poll taxes and literacy tests. Now, we're going to take a look at a literacy test very soon, but poll taxes is a pretty simple phenomenon. It's basically you had to pay a fee in order to vote. And sometimes those fees were exorbitant, lots of money. It could be $50, which in today's money would be somewhere around $250, $260 or so, accounting for inflation. So quite a bit of money there to be able to vote. And the literacy tests were almost impossible. And the main goal of the literacy tests were to be ambiguous. It means that each answer had at least 2 correct answers, but it could be 3 or 4. And what they would do is when they looked over those literacy tests, they essentially said, oh, you got answer possibility 1, and we were looking for 2. And then they might go to the next person and say, oh, you got answer possibility 2, but we were looking for 1. It was basically designed for the people grading them, so to speak, to be able to just make those individuals fail. But here's the most interesting part about all of this. Many white persons were not subject to poll taxes and literacy tests due to something called a grandfather clause. Now, we've all heard the saying, you're grandfathered in. You're grandfathered, so you don't have to worry about it. You get to keep the same thing. Well, where that saying comes from is actually the 15th Amendment here. The grandfather clause essentially means this, that if your grandfather was able to vote, then you do not have to pay a poll tax. You do not have to take a literacy test. And this was a quote unquote clever way to prevent African Americans further from having the ability to vote in some states. And very unfair. And if you think about it, those literacy tests and those poll taxes were designed to continue to prevent people from voting. So if somebody never gained the right to vote, then their children would never qualify for the grandfather tax. And therefore, it would basically, for all eternity and in perpetuity, prevent African Americans from having the opportunity to vote here in the United States. Many believe that full equality in voting truly wasn't achieved until passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. While we're not going to dive into the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because it doesn't really have anything to do with the amendments as a whole, I put this on here just to let you know that it took 95 years before those individuals, after they were given the right to vote, to truly have freedom in voting and to be able to vote for whoever they wished without fear of persecution and without having to jump through hoops, so to speak, and pay poll taxes and take literacy tests and follow grandfather clauses. So 1965 was truly the time period where voting truly became equal for all. So what I have here is a quick video. Hopefully the sound is okay, and we'll go ahead and play that now.
We did some training working with people to prepare them to go to the courthouse to try to register a vote.
This is going down the road and knocking on someone's door and asking them to put their life on the line.
They would go in the courthouse, try to register, be turned away because they didn't know specific provisions of the Mississippi Constitution or whatever other sort of cockeyed criterion the registrar decided to use that day.
95 questions or something like this, just ridiculous, like who was the governor of Mississippi in 1922 or something, you know, just, you couldn't answer these questions. Particularly with people who, for the most part, the sharecroppers, they had very little education. So that was the way to keep them. But also, if you came down to register to vote, just because you came down and had to sign your name, you were fired by the time you got home. So if you had a family and it all depended on the white guy's cotton field, you know.
The problem was that they might lose their job if they registered to vote. I mean, it was not a simple thing. And seeing the often Black people who were so unwilling to look us in the eye because they were so used to looking down in the presence of a white person. And the idea that we would be sitting there talking directly to them about voter registration. I mean, part of our effort was just to give them a chance to get used to being in the presence of a white person who wasn't going to beat them or, you know, didn't look down on them.
I shall not be moved. I shall not be moved, just like a tree.
There were some confrontations in the courthouse. Some people were attacked on the courthouse steps or even in the courthouse itself for trying to register to vote. It took an enormous amount of courage for people to do that because they knew in many ways it was symbolic. They had to demonstrate that they were being denied this right.